Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. To expand or not to expand the child tax credit is a geeky issue that consumes lots of ink and energy on the right and on the left. Much of the debate revolves around the incentive to work lurking in the child tax credit. On one side, you have those who say that no one will stop working for a $2,000 annual credit per child. On the other hand, are those who say that workforce participation will indeed dip as a result. Today, I am delighted to welcome Kevin Corinth to discuss this issue. Kevin is a senior fellow and the deputy director at the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to Qualified Opinion, Kevin.
Thanks, Vero, for having me on.
So to start, I want to ask you, how did you start working on these issues? Tell us a little bit about your research path.
So I've started out mostly focusing on poverty and homelessness issues and have kind of gradually grown in terms of my study breadth over time. The child tax credit in particular, I started studying in 2021 only because of the dramatic changes that took place. Basically, before 2021, we had a tax credit that generally offset tax liabilities and turned into something that was much more of a welfare program. And so that kind of took it back from tax policy, which was less of my focus, into safety net program policy, which was my focus. And sort of I was forced as a result to start doing more on tax policy because so much of what we do to help struggling Americans is being done now through the tax code as opposed to safety net programs.
So tell us actually about the history of the child tax credit. When did it start, and what was it supposed to do and achieve, and where is it now?
So the child tax credit's about 25 years old. It was started in the late 1990s, really as a bipartisan policy. And it really has been bipartisan for the vast majority of the past couple decades. So it started out as a tax credit. So if you are a parent or parents who have dependents under the age of 17, that you could reduce your tax liability and have get a tax credit from the government. So it started out at about $500 per child, required a tax liability or at least earnings, and gradually was expanded over time to first to $1,000. And then during the Trump tax cuts in 2017, the maximum amount was increased to $2,000 per kid. So if you had a child under the age of 17 and you had enough federal income tax liability, you could reduce your federal taxes, or you could get a tax credit of $2,000.
And if I remember, the argument at the time was that the tax code wasn't as generous to families with children at the time. That was the argument. That was the main argument behind the conception of the child tax credit, right?
Yeah. I mean, so there's different ways to think about whether or not we want to have tax credits for families with kids. If you kind of think of it as, some families have with more kids have higher costs, maybe you want to have a lower tax liability for those families. And I think that was the rationale for it. And it's true that it was expanded in 2017. The maximum amount was increased from $1,000 to $2,000 per kid. There was really some offset there because we got rid of sort of exemptions for dependents, which offset some of that increase. But there was still a real increase for families. And that was really motivated by Senator Lee and Senator Rubio, who were pushing for more benefits for families, although they were really focused on working families who pay taxes.
And so during the pandemic, the credit was expanded quite dramatically for a short period of time. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And I almost think the word expansion is the wrong word. I know that's the word that everybody uses, and I've, as a result, sometimes use it as well. But really, it was a replacement. So in 2021, as part of the American Rescue Plan Act that was enacted in March of 2021, sort of as we were coming off the worst of the pandemic, the child tax credit was sort of thrown away. And in its place, we got essentially a child allowance or a universal basic income for kids. So one, it increased the amount substantially from $2,000 per kid up to $3,000 or even $3,600 for the youngest children. And the key change was that it was now provided regardless of whether you had paid any taxes or regardless of whether you work. So if you don't work, you don't pay taxes, you still get $3,000 or $3,600, which is a lot of money.
Yeah. So effectively, it's a spending through the tax code. Can you give us an example? Like, for instance, if you're a single if you're a single mom who makes during the pandemic who had 3 children under 6, you would get almost $12,000 in cash from the government.
Yeah, exactly. And that's from the child tax credit alone. And you would be getting those in terms of in the form of monthly checks.
As opposed to a credit that you would claim, when you filed your taxes. So that, and obviously there was a lot of issues that I had about that credit related to incentives or disincentive to work that it would create. But that has expired. But it seems to me that what it has done is actually show a lot of people, pro-family or Democrats, whatever the arguments are, it opened the door to the possibility of a UBI for kids, right? And ever since, the debate has been, how can we restore some of this? So where are we now?
Yeah, so it's been pretty surprising to me how much the Overton window has shifted as a result of that 2021 policy. I think some people probably thought that policy was, it was geared as a temporary pandemic-related relief program. It was too much too late. Certainly we didn't need it, but that was the motivation. But I think once we had that in place, it's really shifted the dialogue so that basically every Democratic senator and House member is now advocating for making that policy permanent, that we would have this child allowance replacing the child tax credit forever. And that means the IRS delivering those checks. And as a result, basically every year now since the 2021 child tax credit expired, there's a renewed effort to try to make that permanent again.
There's another aspect also that has changed, right? Is that it used to be capped at a level of income that was relatively low. What was shocking about the pandemic child tax credit or UBI-like credit was that it was also benefiting a lot of very wealthy people.
Yeah, so the child tax credit goes up to about $400,000 for a married family and about $200,000 for a sort of head of household, so a single parent family. And then it begins to phase out. And those families were also getting those larger payments, so the $3,000 or $3,600 per child. And it amounts to a very expensive program. Or policy. It costs over $100 billion a year under the current parameters. If you turn it into the child allowance, it becomes more like $200 billion a year, which is a lot. To put in the context of safety net policies, the food stamp program is now, say, around $100 billion. Our cash welfare program is more like $30 billion. So this is a really large cash payment that would be going out to families that now does have near unanimous support at least from the Democrats.
Well, so and it's interesting that you bring the cost, because obviously I care a ton about the cost. And one of the things when during the 2017 tax debate and when Senator Rubio and Senator Lee proposed that expansion, which I was against, I was particularly outraged by the fact that while they wanted to pay for it. They wanted to pay for it with an increase in the basically they would reduce the corporate income tax less than planned. So I can't remember, like the original plan was 20%, and then it ended up settling on 21. And it was really annoying to me, even though I absolutely approve the paying for it side of this. It's like the corporate income tax is pretty much the most distortive tax that we have. So I thought it was very unfortunate. But now, in the conversation, really, I mean, if you left it to the Democrats, I mean, we would get this enormous expansion of the child tax credit without much pay for.
Yeah, I think that's very reckless. And you would think that with inflation rates growing and staying high, and with the resulting debt payments being extremely high, that would give pause to many in Congress. But I don't think that's the case. I think that if there were a vote tomorrow in the Senate, you would get almost every Senate Democrat to vote for it.
And the thing that's also kind of making matter worse is that the expansion, I'm going to use a word you don't like, but the current debate over the Wyden-Smith expansion actually wouldn't even be a pay for, would be a trade-off between two types of tax cuts. On one hand, you'd have the expansion of the child tax credit traded for extension of some of the Trump tax cuts. So it's like two basically big impact on the deficit, right?
Yeah, agree. And so the Wyden-Smith bill, which I don't think we've quite gotten into yet, but it's sort of it's not the child allowance, right? So it's not it's not turning this into a child allowance. There'd still be a work requirement, although the work requirement would sort of in some ways be cut in half because you only have to work every other year to get it. It would also substantially expand benefits for those with multiple children, especially if you're making about $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And so the cost is substantially smaller than the child allowance, but it's sort of a step towards that exact policy. And I do worry about some of even the halfway parts. You know, there's some parts that encourage work, but there's some parts that really disincentivize work. And it can really disincentivize people from moving from, say, part-time to full-time work. It really loads up the incentives on working at least every other year and working at least to make about $15,000 to $20,000 a year, which is sort of part-time work at be $15 an hour wage. And it really reduces the incentives for sort of upward mobility beyond that point.
So before we talk about this, which I think is really like an incredibly important aspect of your research, the Wyden-Smith proposal, that's what is at play, right? So if there is an expansion, this is mostly the form it will take. Right, it's not a return to the UBI is not on the table. Right, I just want to be kind of clear about what's at stake right now.
Yep. So the House passed the Wyden-Smith proposal, which is not the child allowance; it's this light version, and that's what's has been debated by the Senate for the past month or so.
So I want to talk about what a lot of your research is literally the go-to research, and you've been attacked for it massively on basically the incentive or disincentive to work created by the child tax credit. Can you give us a little retrospective on your work on this?
Sure. So the biggest paper was back in 2021 when the child allowance was being debated. So the existing, it gets confusing. What's the existing one? The existing child tax credit, what we got from the Trump tax cuts, that child tax credit, encourages work because you only get it if you work. It phases in with each dollar of earnings at about a 15% rate. And if you stop working, you no longer get it.
And when is the phase out, basically?
So the phase out was under the Trump tax cuts, they increased it up to $400,000 for a married couple and $200,000 for a single filer or head of household filer, so a single parent with kids.
Yeah.
And it phases out from there on. So it goes up pretty high.
Yeah.
But it does encourage work both to work at all or to, increase your hours if you're sort of a part-time worker. And so the paper I did with my co-authors in 2021 came right in the heat of the debate on whether to take that child tax credit and turn it into that child allowance that we had in 2021 and make that permanent. And so we simulated the effects of that proposed permanent policy change, or what would happen in the long run if this were made permanent law. And we estimated, using sort of the highest quality data, using the sort of assumptions about responsiveness to work incentives from the academic literature and government organizations, we found that it would reduce employment by about 1.5 million parents per year, which is substantial. I mean, it's maybe 2.5% of parents. So percent-wise, it's not everybody, but it's a big deal. And I think it was helped inform some of the policymakers' decisions on whether or not to go.
And the disincentive to work, I assume, wouldn't affect every job holder, right? Was it more pronounced for lower income people, or did you look at that question?
Yeah, so every parent, if you went ahead with the child allowance, every parent would have a lower incentive to work. But the vast majority of parents, especially those who are making, say, $80,000 or $200,000, we don't expect that $2,000 times through, say, 2 or 3 kids. That might be $4,000 or $6,000. That's substantial, but they're probably not going to drop out of the workforce as a result.
And in this case, it would also present as a tax credit as opposed to receiving a check, right?
Yeah. So the current one is the current CTC is a tax credit.
Yeah.
And essentially the policy is you're basically taking that away and saying now everyone's going to get the same cash check, same check every month, no matter what. And so the labor supply effects that we estimated were concentrated especially among sort of single parents, single mothers, those who typically receive the earned income tax credit, and they made up the majority of the work reduction we found. We did find there'd be some parents who made somewhat higher incomes, maybe some who live in married couples as well, because the amounts are substantial, but the majority would be single moms.
Yeah, and of course the reason why we care about this is because working is like the best way out of poverty. And I think, isn't that something that we really learned during the welfare reform of the 90s, or am I totally off base on this?
We did learn that. Some people seem to want to forget that or to say that it's out of date, but it's by far the best policy experiment we have on work incentives, especially for single parents, because before welfare reform in the mid 1990s, we essentially had monthly cash payments going to single parents, and we saw what happened. We had low rates of work, higher rates of single parent families, and then when welfare reform happened, you saw an amazing increase in employment among single parents.
And a decrease in poverty for children, right?
And a decline in poverty for kids, and lots of great research finding that tax credits, like the earned income tax credit, which requires work, has really beneficial effects on kids, both in the short term in terms of, say, test scores, but also in the long run in terms of their earnings, employment, lessened dependency, less time spent in prison. So we did a lot of good for families and kids, both in the short run and the long run, by requiring work. And it kind of baffles me why people now want to forget that or say, oh, it's 30 years. Oh, it is 30 years ago. But it's really the best evidence we have of when you do something big to require work, you get really good results. Going back on that would be extremely risky in my mind.
And is the connection between parents working and child poverty per se, is this a causation that's well established in the literature?
There's really good causal evidence that increased income that results from work is very positive for kids. It's not and that's from the earned income tax credit changes.
Yeah.
Now, some will say that as a result, we can extrapolate to say if we just give more money to kids, regardless of the source, we're still going to get those outcomes. But that's not at all clear. The evidence we have from things like other programs, it looked like SNAP, so the food stamp program, which was expanded in the 60s and 70s, that did not require work. And that actually did lead to benefits for kids. But that is 70 years or 60 years old, and at a time when, kids had much lower levels of nutrition. And in general, the best evidence we have in terms of the most robust evidence and strongest effects comes from policies that require work as opposed to that don't.
So to your estimation, the expansion of the child tax credit that is on the table right now, the White and Smith one, what would be the impact on work? And then we can talk about marriage. What would the impact be, and who would it be for?
Yeah, so it has several different provisions, and it's pretty complicated in terms of the incentives it produces. So in terms of work, I would say it's overall uncertain. There's certain provisions that would certainly discourage work. And that's this sort of 1 year look back, which says it's okay if you don't work this year, as long as you worked last year, and then you still get the benefit. So you can essentially work. It's not like everyone's going to be dropping in and out, but like if I don't work last year, I can still get it this year. And that would reduce the incentive to work. And then there's this sort of per child benefit, which says instead of giving you the refundable portion, regardless of number of kids, it's going to multiply it by the number of kids. So if I work, say I earn like $20,000 a year, it could increase my benefits substantially. Now that's going to increase the incentive to work somewhat, at least to get that $20,000 earnings level. The problem is that it's going to reduce the incentive to now move up the earnings ladder. So maybe to work full time or to get married. And that's something that hasn't really been focused on enough. In my mind, one of the biggest factors, I think, for poor kids to succeed is, one, having a parent who works, but it's also great if the parents are married because that brings more income and more stability into the household. And you're creating some very large marriage penalties by enacting this sort of the White and Smith reform.
So you would think conservatives would be very sensitive to this, and yet, and you just find very little opposition to it on the conservative side.
Yeah, it's surprising. I mean, there's sort of less empirical evidence on the effects of marriage incentives on marriage, so I can understand that there's uncertainty. But to me, when you create such large marriage disincentives, where it's like every dollar you sort of make by having a spouse, sort of 83 cents or something is lost in terms of higher taxes and reduced welfare benefits. At some point, people are going to respond, and this becomes a risk. So I am surprised, maybe it's a lack of awareness, but I do think conservatives who care about marriage should take a very close look at how this would change marriage incentives.
So, and I don't know if you've seen Melissa Kearney. Well, I'm sure you have seen Melissa Kearney's book about the two parents privilege, but there's clearly an advantage for children to have two parents. And unfortunately, this is a privilege. I think it's smart for her to call it a privilege because she's mostly talking to her friends on the left. There's clearly an advantage to have two parents, and that privilege is concentrated at higher income levels. So now, unfortunately, in her book, she doesn't seem to kind of believe that there's any connection between not being married and welfare payments. But at the very least, I think she really has done just a great job talking about the advantage for children of having two parents, and so I'm wondering whether this is going to help draw awareness on maybe some of the causes for that just enormous discrepancy between higher income people versus lower income people. So anyway, what are one of the things that I thought was the most striking aspect of your research was how the child tax credit, expansion or not, interacts with other programs. And I think that this is something we just don't talk about enough. I realized after I read your work on this, and especially you have this really kind of great chart where you only look at the accumulation of for different level of income of SNAP, so food stamps, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and then you model what the expansion would look like. And what I never really quite see, because this is not my area of expertise, is just how these programs interact. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, no, and I think this is probably the most important point of the whole debate, because it oftentimes becomes disconnected from other programs. And if we didn't have these other programs, I'd probably be in favor of a child allowance if we had nothing else for poor kids. So yeah, to go to your question, we have a large set of other programs already in place to assist both, families with parents who don't work at all and families who do work. And a lot of these policies are in place because of the welfare reform that we had in the 90s. So one is SNAP or food stamps, and that's available to families who don't work. But even as you work, there's a lot of deductions. You still get to keep a lot of the benefits. So if you're talking about a single mom with, say, 3 kids, she's still probably getting about $12,000 in SNAP benefits, in addition to, say, earning about $15,000 to $20,000 of earnings. On top of that, we have the earned income tax credit, which is also quite substantial, something like $7,000 for a single mom with about 3 kids. So already with SNAP and the earned income tax credit, you're at about, say, $20,000 of benefits on top of her earnings. Then you add on the existing child tax credit that can provide another, say, 2 or 3 kids, another few $1,000s. And then the reform, the White and Smith reform would add on another $2,000 or $3,000 on that.
So let's sum it up. If you have a single mom with 3 kids, and she makes through work $15,000 just with these 3 programs, does it total roughly $38,000?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. But so the real disincentive to work comes from, you could, and this of course excludes all sorts of other programs. This is only a focus on 3 things, right? I remember when I had asked you, you said that these numbers omit benefits such as Medicaid, CHIP, child care assistance, school meals, WIC, energy assistance, TANF, housing assistance, Social Security disability for children, and state earned income tax credit and child tax credit. I was actually looking this morning. There are 11 states that have fully refundable child tax credit. I think these numbers are so it is really it is, you hate to say this, it's like our system does create a little bit of incentive to work, but you could actually be doing fairly well, like working just a little bit. And maybe this is what we want. That's a normative question, but it is really, so there's this, right? Like, so we can talk at this level, how much incentive to work you have. But what is striking about the chart you have is actually to really look at the cliffs that occur when you start working more, right? And then can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so we've done, a pretty good job of encouraging people to work up to that $15,000 to $20,000 level of earnings. And the problem is that's good, but then you've sort of got to phase things out, all these benefits out, and you have to have people start paying taxes. And so when you move from, say, like $20,000 of earnings, and you think about moving up to, say, $40,000 of earnings, which is a realistic scenario for someone thinking about moving from, say, part-time work to full-time work at a moderate hourly wage, you are creating some very large penalties on increasing your income, and could very easily get to over 100% levels of taxes, implicit taxes, if you're not only getting the programs that I've included in my figure, but also are getting some of the other ones you mentioned, such as housing assistance.
So let's give a concrete example. If I remember, I won't remember exactly the numbers, but so we say roughly $38,000 total with these three programs if you work and make $15,000. If you go to $40,000 of paid work, your total first, you have the first really big cliff, which is SNAP, right? You lose all of these benefits, right? So if you were making $12,000, you lose all of this. And then there's some earned income tax credit decline, and then there's some child tax credit decline. And I think your calculation was roughly that if you more than double your paid earnings, you actually only will make maybe $3,000 more or something like that, right?
Exactly, yes.
And obviously working means having to file childcare, there's just a lot of constraints that come from working more.
Yeah, those are the numbers, and sort of that's made the point of the post was that sort of we already have those existing penalties from losing SNAP, from the very large phase out of the earned income tax credit, from starting to pay federal income taxes, state income taxes, the continued payment of federal payroll taxes. So all these things layered on top of each other create an existing penalty on sort of moving to full-time work or getting married that would be exacerbated by the Wyden-Smith reforms.
Yeah, so it would be exacerbated, but it already exists as it is now, right? So the difficulty that exists in actually trying to design a system that helps lower income people is precisely this idea. It's precisely this cliff problems, right? This marginal tax rate effectively of 100%, where you can double the amount of money you make and still make the same money because you're losing everything. And this is one of the reasons why some conservatives are pushing this UBI for children, which comes with a lot of problems. So what's the solution? I don't think there's a solution to avoid the cliff, but what do you think would be the best way to go about it?
Yeah, so I agree it's unavoidable. And if you want to provide benefits that are targeted towards lower income people, then as they make more income, they're going to lose those benefits. We have to live with that trade-off. I don't want, and I think most people don't want, a true universal basic income. It's way too expensive. It would cause many more problems than the things it would solve. So we basically have to live with that trade-off. And I would just say we need to be smart about, first of all, know what we already have, and then be smart about, we're going to be phasing out benefits, but do it smoothly over time. And when you add on a new program, be very careful about what it's going to do to existing incentives. And so I think we need to be very careful about adding on existing benefits because it could exacerbate some of those incentives even further.
Yeah. I just think that this is really a conversation we should absolutely be having, because if you believe that there's some value in self-sufficiency, and whether it is for the benefit for the parents and then what it models for the children, I think we should be having this conversation. But let's talk now about the pushback you've gotten. And then I want to kind of go over some of the arguments that are used to make the case that we need to subsidize families. So what are the people who disagree with you? What is it they're saying that you're getting wrong?
Yeah, so there's been criticism going back to 2021 at this point. And what's interesting is that, there was this big National Academy of Sciences panel report that was sort of the intellectual underpinning for that 2021 CTC expansion, which was really a conversion to a child allowance. And that report and the existing research to date really didn't recognize that work incentives would diminish at all. They kind of made this very simple error, which we corrected. And fortunately, people now begrudgingly, I think, acknowledged that work incentives would decline.
And you got a lot of pushback on this.
But the pushback is now on how people will respond to those incentives. And there's a lot of very strong research. And we pulled from that research and sort of provided, used the academic consensus pre-2021 about how parents and especially single moms would respond to work incentives. Unfortunately, it seems like once people recognized how the incentives would change, that their perceptions of the responsiveness to those incentives, it seems like they thought they'd be weaker. And I don't want to draw too strong of conclusions about people's motivated reasoning. But the pushback has now become around, yes, incentives would change if you went to a child allowance, but how much would people actually respond in terms of their behavior? We really don't know. We have evidence mostly from the 90s, which it's 30 years old, fair enough. But I don't know if it would be stronger or weaker today.
Incentives are incentives, to kind of acknowledge on one hand that there are incentives, and then saying, but it won't matter. It seems kind of a contradiction in terms. But so where do you think conservatives fall on this issue?
I think conservatives pretty much unanimously believe that this child tax credit should require work. I think there was a time in 2021 where it was unclear if that would be the universal position. But I think after that debate happened, now all conservatives generally agree that there should be a work requirement. Where there's a lot of disagreement is on, how fast the benefit should phase in and how high the maximum benefit should be. And I guess the White and Smith has introduced this curveball too, which actually does relax the work requirement itself. That was sort of surprising to me because all the debate before that would not have allowed for that. So,
not to mention that it makes things very complicated, right? It makes things complicated. I mean, it's just like, I've read the description of this extension with its like look back and 2 years, and I was just like, my head was spinning. So
it's extremely complicated, and it layers, as we've noted, on top of other programs and policies. Some might say that's good because if it's so complicated, no one's going to understand the work incentive effects. But I am not so sure. I mean, you kind of learn by doing, and I do worry that we're going to confuse the policymakers a lot, and they're going to do things that they inadvertently disincentivize the things they care most about, such as work and marriage.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to one of my opposition actually to the child tax credit and to distributing so much benefits through the tax codes. It's like, I think the tax code should be there to raise revenue by creating the least possible amount of distortions. There's always going to be distortions, but we have carved the tax cut so much that first, there's no horizontal equity. So it means that depending on how many kids you have, whether you own a house, whether you do this or that, basically two households that look exactly the same on paper could be paying very, different amount of money depending on these factors, which we can kind of argue over whether these are a good reason to carve the tax cut for, the tax code for. And it just really kind of, that's just kind of it's really one of the things that I think we don't talk enough about. So what's your position on this?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I agree we don't want to carve out tax cuts for homeowners and special situations. I may disagree with you, I guess, on this one case of the child tax credit. I guess when I think about horizontal equity, I see a large family and I see a small with lots of kids, and I see a small family with no or few kids. The large family with more kids has higher costs to raise those children, and sort of I see rationale to give.
But you're assuming
lower taxes.
You seem to be assuming that basically children are not at all durable consumption goods, when I actually see that the main benefits of my children are for me, right? I mean, and it's not that I don't think there's not. I believe it. More people as better. I want more people. I want more people with kids, and but I still think that a lot of these conversations are like, I find them, I will admit, a little strange, even though this is not a convincing argument against the child tax credit. I've come to realize this, which is like, you make the decision to it's your decision to have children. And yeah, like decisions that you make in your life. Why should you then shift the cost or demand that somehow your decisions be subsidized? I mean, now, I recognize, again, this is not the most convincing arguments against the child tax credit, but it does kind of bother me, because if you want to think about a lot of the things that people do that benefit the whole society, right? And you and I have talked about this, like innovators, massive return for society, and they keep very little of the benefits. And children, to me, it seems to be the reverse. And then we put so much, weight on just families.
Yeah, no, and I think there's arguments both ways. I definitely don't view my children as consumption. I love my kids, and I guess I do enjoy much of the time with them, but they're a lot of work. In a good way. But yeah, I don't know. I guess, people's labor force decisions, whether you work, how much you work, those are decisions too. I think it's complicated.
It is complicated.
I don't know. I maybe it's because I have 3 kids and I want lower taxes.
Yeah, I understand. But so it goes to another thing that actually frustrates me. And I never really quite thought about it. I just finished a paper on export subsidies. And so I read a lot of trade policies, for better or worse. And one of the things that I realized about the discussion on trade policies in the 80s and the 90s, and even to some extent with some people now, is that the conversation always takes place in how is giving export subsidies, what is the benefit of giving export subsidies compared to something else, right? As opposed to free trade, for instance. A lot of the way the conversation is framed is around this kind of, what is the alternative, and how do you what's the best way to and there's very little of this in the with the child tax credit, or with a lot of the welfare, and it seems to me that there are much better ways to support families. Like, for instance, there's a trade-off between credit versus lower marginal tax rates. Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of before the child tax rate was expanded, we had, it was an exemption for dependents. Well, we had both the child tax credit of $1,000 credit per child and an exemption that sort of would probably better reduce the rates. I mean, basically to zero for some amount of income. So I don't know. I haven't thought enough about the tax policy, like other ways to do this.
What about regulation, right? I mean, like, there are so many barriers to families, family with children, zoning laws, obviously, like big impediment to having more children in a world where we think that everyone should have their own room. Obviously, that was not a problem in the past, but you piled everyone in, like 6 kids in a 2-bedroom household. But but anyway, it's just, I wish, in the same way as I think your research is so important precisely because it puts the child tax credit, it shows the interaction with the other programs. I think it'd be always worth to ask the question about what are the alternatives?
Yeah. And I would totally agree with you on, I think the CTC and tax policy, I don't think that's really going to do much to encourage fertility. I think we do need a lot more babies and just more humans in our country, people who are going to produce and innovate. And I worry a lot about where kids are living and how many kids people are having. And I think regulation is a much bigger deal than, tax incentives. And housing is the biggest one. School choice is another way to encourage more kids. And I think like the cultural side is probably
Yes.
even more important than even the regulation side. I don't know how to do we don't want to try to do that with government policy, but just being more like family friendly, like supporting kids on airplanes, dealing with kids crying here and there. Like, I think the culture and like having extended family supporting the nuclear family, part of that is housing. I mean, there's an interaction between culture and regulation because if, parents and their kids can't live nearby the grandparents because they're priced out of certain housing markets, that makes it much more harder to raise kids. So I am extremely pro baby, extremely pro children. And I think tackling the regulation and the cultural issues are the biggest things we can do. The tax policy side, I think it's very much in the policy debates. We have to do something on it. And I certainly would not do a child allowance. I think it makes sense to have a child tax credit, although I understand those who view kids as really a choice and a consumption item, and therefore maybe we don't want to do that.
Well, so I will tell you, like my argument against the child tax credit have evolved in a way, and because of you. And it's not that I don't think carving the tax code for all of this is a problem, and I don't. And I don't. It's not. I mean, I was giving the durable consumption good mostly as a joke, but or as a kind of a debate kind of point. But it's really not that. In the end, I think what is really now kind of got me very exercised against the child tax credit, but against other things too, is basically it seems to me that because of this interaction between all of these programs, what we are doing, it seems to me, is create a two-tier system of people who are going to be working just a little, and that's good, but actually we're going to keep them at this level because effectively we're creating a government system that is giving them disincentive to work more. And meanwhile, right, you have the child tax credit that are benefiting, higher income people, and it doesn't really create disincentive to work at all for them. And it's basically all, upside for them. And that, since I saw this chart, in a way, you've radicalized me in a way that I, before I was kind of like having the typical libertarians argument against the child tax credit. And now, this is really the thing that really bothers me about it. And I just, I figured I had to make these points to kind of see how you reacted. But really, this is really what bothers me. It seems to me we're creating a two-tiers system. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the child tax credit as it is today too sort of like works against that because it does take a while to fully phase in because it's only offsetting tax liability to get the full portion. Mm-hmm. And it's the changes being suggested are putting it back into that category of doing more of the subsidizing just that kind of part-time work. So in terms of the broader question of whether that's sort of a good idea, I mean, it's hard because, again, in the 1990s, like we had sort of a different problem of just lots of subsidies for just those without working at all. And the result, we've maybe gone overboard in some ways, but we've now created so many benefits for those kind of part-time, lower earning families. And it's really hard to get out of that. And, some of it could be just better. You think about training, but our training programs don't work. You can think about, occupational licensing and encouraging entrepreneurship, which is good, but that's probably not the full thing. So yeah, I think it's not really given enough attention. I think people just aren't aware. I mean, I always hate to say awareness is the solution, but it really is the first step. When you layer all these programs on each other, I don't think people realize how much we provide. And I would say in terms of solutions, as bad as you might think it is for if you just look at, a figure that includes food stamps and earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, like there's programs that layered on top of that, which make things worse. So one policy that I'm especially focused on is our rental housing assistance programs. That's a really big benefit. It could be, $1,000 a month, so $12,000 a year, basically another food stamps, and that gets phased away too. And if you make it public housing where like you can't even move physically, that's a really bad idea. So I think some of it's being smart about our existing policies and saying, do we really want to tie people to certain places and provide these huge benefits to some who get lucky to get drawn in and then really never get out?
Is the one of the solutions to have kind of more of these programs kind of blended together, like have one program that actually lasts for longer, but decline at a lower rate, and you keep it longer, which is also kind of annoying because like there's a moment of where you actually you could do it on your own, but because we're worried about that cliff, it's worth, I don't know. I like what do you think? Like, just because that's the other thing is like having all these different programs just seems very paternalistic and just create all these different cliffs to the point that just, I don't know that people keep them all in their heads.
Yeah. I think combining is very good, at least for some of the programs. I would keep like the child tax credit separate.
Yeah.
Because I think it makes, most of it is actually a non-refundable tax credit that offsets tax liability. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to keep that separate from the safety net programs. But for the safety net programs, I think it would be probably good to combine them and just make it more transparent. Both for policymakers and for the recipients. And I think the other thing we should do a lot more of is more like temporary assistance. Like when people face a shock, say you're probably getting food stamps and some other benefits, but you may be working, like you might lose your job and you may not be able to pay the rent for a few months or, like have the resources you need for your kids' school supplies. That's exactly the thing that we want to protect against. And you can do that without creating these long-term disincentives. And so a lot more just temporary relief to families who are facing economic shocks, or they get kicked out of their house by their parents, or they have some domestic violence problem. Like we can give them a couple or even several $1,000s if needed for 6 months or maybe a year, and plug those holes and then make sure they're set up for future success. And that, in my mind, would be a much better use of dollars than creating these permanent programs that once you get on, you qualify forever. I think that's the recipe for the long-term dependency and lack of work that we're worried about.
Yeah, it's a good idea. And again, I can't stress enough how you and Scott have radicalized me and in a way kind of made me just more worried about what we're doing with these programs. So, we could talk about this forever, but to finish, what is one of the main claim that people are mostly mistaken about that you'd like to correct?
In terms of the child tax credit debate, which I guess I'll bring it back to that, I would say that and this is something that we've already probably discussed, but that the child tax credit changes being proposed are a middle-class tax cut. It's really sold in that way. It's like a marketing plea or marketing ploy that says, okay, like hardworking Americans are being hurt by inflation. Cost of living's gone up, which is true. Real wages aren't going up enough, which is true. So look, we're going to expand the child tax credit and give everyone a tax cut. The thing is, these policies that are being proposed, both the child allowance and even the Wyden-Smith bill, the vast majority of benefits are not tax relief. They're essentially benefit payments. And you might prefer benefit payments, but then call it that and don't pretend that you're actually providing tax relief to those who are paying taxes, because it's largely not that. So my I guess plea would just be for just truth in marketing. If you want to provide more benefits to low-income families, be honest about what we've already provided and then how this would affect work and marriage incentives going forward. If you're okay with that trade-off, then great, still support it, but at least acknowledge the incentives that already exist and how this would affect those incentives.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have today, but thank you so much, Kevin. This was great.
Thank you.